everyone, Erin here, a librarian from the Central Library, and it's time to continue our reading of The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. When we left off, Gerda was searching the wide world for her friend Kay, who had been taken by the Snow Queen. She had just met a prince and princess who gave her a golden carriage to help her continue on her way. So, if everyone is nice and relaxed and sitting comfortably, let's read on. The fourth story, The Little Robber Maiden. They drove through the dark, dark forest. The carriage shone like a torch, and unfortunately, its brightness attracted the eyes of the robbers who dwelt in the shadows of the forest. "That is gold!" they cried. They rushed forward, seized the horses, stabbed the outriders, coachman, and footman to death, and dragged little Gerda out of the carriage. "She is plump, she is pretty, she has been fed on nut kernels," said the old robber wife, who had a long bristly beard and eyebrows hanging like bushes over her eyes. "She is like a little fat lamb, and how smartly she is dressed." And she drew out her bright dagger, glittering most terribly. "Oh, oh!" cried the woman, for, the very moment she had lifted her dagger to stab Gerda, her own wild and wilful daughter jumped on her back and bit her ear violently. "You naughty child!" said the mother. "She shall play with me," said the little robber maiden. "She shall give me her muff and her pretty frock and sleep with me in my bed." Then she bit her mother again, till the robber wife sprang up and shrieked with pain, while the robbers all laughed, saying, "Look at her playing with her young one." So spoiled and wayward was the little robber maiden that she always had her own way, and she and Gerda sat together in the carriage and drove further and further into the wood. The little robber maiden was about as tall as Gerda, but much stronger. She had broad shoulders and a very dark skin. Her eyes were quite black, and had an almost melancholy expression. She put her arm around Gerda's waist and said, "She shan't kill you so long as I love you. Aren't you a princess?" "No," said Gerda. And then she told her all that had happened to her, and how much she loved little Kay. The robber maiden looked earnestly in her face, shook her head, and said, "She shall not kill you even if I do quarrel with you. Then, indeed, I would rather do it myself." And she dried Gerda's tears and put both her hands into the pretty muff that was so soft and warm. The carriage stopped at last in the middle of the courtyard of the robber's castle. This castle was half ruined. Crows and ravens flew out of the openings, and some fearfully large bulldogs, looking as if they could devour a man in a moment, jumped round the carriage. They did not bark, for that was forbidden them. The maidens entered a large smoky hall, where a tremendous fire was blazing on the stone floor. A huge cauldron full of soup was boiling on the fire, while hares and rabbits were roasting on the spit. "You shall sleep with me and my little pets tonight," said the robber maiden. Then they had some food, and afterwards went to the corner, where there was some straw and a piece of carpet. Nearly 100 pigeons were perched on staves and laths around them. They were asleep, but started up when the little maidens approached. "These all belong to me," said Gerda's companion, and seizing hold of one of the nearest, she held the poor bird by the feet and swung it round. "Kiss it," she said, flapping it into Gerda's face. "The rabble from the woods sit up there," continued she, pointing to a number of laths fastened across a hole in the wall. "Those are wood pigeons. They would fly away if I didn't keep them shut up. And here is my old favorite." She pulled forward a reindeer who wore a bright copper ring round his neck, by which he was fastened to a large stone. "We have to chain him up, or he would run away from us. Every evening I tickle his neck with my sharp dagger, and it makes him so frightened of me." And the robber maiden drew out a long dagger from a gap in the wall and ran it down the reindeer's throat. The poor animal struggled and kicked, but the girl laughed, and then she pulled Gerda into bed with her. "Are you going to keep the dagger in your hand while you sleep?" asked Gerda, looking timidly at the dangerous plaything. "I always sleep with my dagger by my side," replied the little robber maiden. "One never knows what may happen. But now tell me all over again what you told me before about Kay, and the reason for your coming into the wide world all by yourself." So Gerda told her story again, and the imprisoned wood pigeons listened, but the others were fast asleep. The little robber maiden threw one arm round Gerda's neck and, holding the dagger with the other, was also soon asleep. But Gerda could not close her eyes throughout the night. She didn't know what would become of her or whether she would even be allowed to live. The robbers sat round the fire drinking and singing. Oh, it was a dreadful night for the poor girl. Then the wood pigeon spoke. Coo, coo, coo. We have seen little Kay. A white bird carried his sledge. He was in the Snow Queen's chariot, which passed through the wood whilst we sat in our nests. She breathed on us young ones as she passed, and all died of her breath, excepting us two. Coo, coo, coo. What are you saying? Cried Gerda. Where was the Snow Queen going? Do you know anything about it? She traveled most likely to Lapland, where ice and snow abide all the year round. Ask the reindeer tied up there. Yes, ice and snow are there all through the year. It is a glorious land, said the reindeer. There, free and happy, one can roam through the wide sparkling valleys. There the Snow Queen has her summer tent. Her strong castle is a long way off, near the North Pole, on an island called Spitzbergen. Oh, Kay, dear Kay, sighed Gerda. When morning came, Gerda told the little robber maiden what the wood pigeons had said, and the little robber maiden looked grave for a moment, and she nodded her head. Do you know where Lapland is? She asked of the reindeer. Who should know better than me? Returned the animal, his eyes kindling. There I was born and bred. How often I have bounded over the wild icy plains there. Listen to me, said the robber maiden to Gerda. You see, all our men are going out, but my mother is still here and will stay behind. Towards noon she will drink a little out of a great flask, and after that she will sleep. Then I will do something for you. When her mother was fast asleep, the robber maiden went up to the reindeer and said, I should have great pleasure in stroking you a few more times with my sharp dagger, for you look so comic. But never mind, I will undo your chain and help you to escape, on condition that you run as fast as you can to Lapland and take this little girl to the castle of the Snow Queen, where her playfellow is. You must have heard her story, for she speaks loud enough, and you're good at eavesdropping. The reindeer bounded with joy, and the robber maiden lifted Gerda on his back, taking care to bind her on firmly as well as to give her a little cushion to sit on. And here, she said, are your fur boots. You will need them in that cold country. The muff I will keep for myself. It is too pretty to part with. But you won't be frozen. Here are my mother's huge gloves. They reach up to the elbow. Put them on. Now your hands look as clumsy as my old mother's. Gerda shed tears of joy. I cannot bear to see you crying, said the little robber maiden. You ought to look glad. See, here are 2 loaves and a piece of bacon for you, so you're not hungry on the way. She fastened this food onto the reindeer's back too, opened the door, called away the great dogs, and then, cutting the reindeer's rope with her dagger, shouted to him, Now then, run, but take good care of the little girl. Gerda stretched out her hands to the robber maiden and bade her farewell, and the reindeer bounded through the forest, over stock and stone, over desert and heath, over meadow and moor. The wolves howled and the ravens shrieked. There was a noise in the sky. Choo, choo! A red light flashed. One might have thought the sky was sneezing. Those are my dear old northern lights, said the reindeer. Look at them. Aren't they beautiful? And he ran faster than ever, night and day. The loaves were eaten, so was the bacon, and then, at last, they were in Lapland. The 5th story, The Lapland Woman and the Finland Woman. They stopped at a little hut. It was a miserable building. The roof very nearly touched the ground, and the door was so low that whoever wished to go in, either in or out, had to crawl on hands and knees. No one was at home except an old Lapland woman, who was busy boiling fish over an old lamp. The reindeer told her Gerda's whole story, but not, however, till after he had made her acquainted with his own, which seemed to him to be much more important. Poor Gerda, meanwhile, was so overpowered by the cold that she could not speak. Ah, poor thing, said the Lapland woman. You have still a long way before you. You have 100 miles to run before you can arrive in Finland. The Snow Queen dwells there, and burns blue lights every evening. I will write a few words on a piece of dried stockfish, for paper I have none, and you may take it with you to the wise Finland woman who lives there. She will advise you better than I can." So when Gerda had warmed herself well and eaten some food, the Lapland woman wrote a few words on the stockfish, told Gerda to take care of it, and bound her once more firmly on the reindeer's back. They sped onwards. The wonderful northern lights, which were now the loveliest, brightest blue color, shone all through the night, and with these splendid lights they arrived in Finland, and knocked on the wise woman's door, and no door to her house. It was very hot inside, so much so that the wise woman wore scarcely any clothing. She was low in stature and very dirty. She loosened little Gerda's dress, took off her fur boots and thick gloves, laid a piece of ice on the reindeer's head, and then read what was written on the stockfish. She read it 3 times. After the 3rd reading, she knew it by heart, so she threw the fish into the porridge pot, for it would make a very excellent supper, and she never wasted anything. The reindeer then repeated his own story, and when that was finished, he told her about little Gerda's adventures, and the wise woman twinkled her wise eyes, but never said a word. "Won't you mix this little maid in that wonderful draught which will give her the strength of 12 men, so she can overcome the Snow Queen?" said the reindeer. "The strength of 12 men," repeated the wise woman. "That would be a lot of good." And she walked away, drew out a large parchment roll from a shelf, and began to read. She read so intently that perspiration ran down her forehead. At last her eyes began to twinkle again, and she drew the reindeer into a corner, and putting a fresh piece of ice upon his head, whispered, "Little Kay is still with the Snow Queen, where he finds everything so much to his liking that he believes it to be the best place in the world. But that is because he has a glass splinter in his heart and a glass splinter in his eye. Until he has got rid of them, he will never feel like a human being, and the Snow Queen will always have power over him. But can't you give Gerda something that will overcome all these evil influences?" "I can give her no power as great as that which she already possesses. Her power is greater than ours, because it comes from her heart, from her being a loving and innocent child. If it cannot give her access to the Snow Queen's palace and help her to free Kay's eye and heart from the glass fragment, then we can do nothing for her. The Snow Queen's garden is 2 miles hence. Carry the little maiden there and put her down by the bush bearing red berries and half covered with snow. Don't waste any time about it, and hasten back." Then the wise woman lifted Gerda onto the reindeer's back, and away they went. "Oh, I've left my boots behind! I have left my gloves behind!" cried little Gerda, but it was too late. The cold was piercing, but the reindeer dared not stop. He ran on until he reached the bush with the red berries. Here he set Gerda down, kissed her, and tears rolling down his cheeks the while, he ran quickly back again, which was the best thing he could do. And there stood poor Gerda, without shoes, without gloves, alone in that barren region, that terribly icy cold Finland. She ran on as fast as she could. A whole regiment of snowflakes came to meet her. They did not fall from the sky, which was cloudless and bright with the northern lights. They ran straight along the ground, and the farther Gerda advanced, the larger they grew. Then she remembered how large and curious the snowflakes had appeared to her the day she had looked at them through a magnifying glass. These, however, were very much larger. They were living forms. They were, in fact, the Snow Queen's guards, and their shapes were the strangest that could be imagined. Some looked like great ugly porcupines, others like snakes rolled into knots with their heads peering out, and others like little fat bears with bristling hair. Little Gerda began to repeat the Lord's Prayer, and it was so cold that she could see her own breath, which, as it escaped from her mouth, ascended into the air like vapor. The cold grew intense, the vapor more dense, and at length it took the form of little bright angels, which, as they touched the earth, became larger and more distinct. They wore helmets on their heads and carried shields and spears in their hands. Their numbers increased so rapidly that, by the time Gerda had finished her prayer, a whole legion stood round her. They thrust their spears among the horrible snowflakes, which fell into thousands of pieces, and little Gerda walked on, unhurt and undaunted. The angels touched her hands and feet, and then she scarcely felt the cold, and approached the Snow Queen's palace boldly. But before we accompany her there, let us see what Kay is doing. He is currently not thinking of his little Gerda. Least of all does he think that she is now standing at the palace gates. The sixth story, the Snow Queen's Palace. The walls of the palace were made of the driven snow, its doors and windows of the cutting winds. There were 100 halls, the largest of them many miles long, all illuminated by the northern lights. All alike were vast, empty, icily cold, and dazzlingly white. In the middle of the empty, interminable snow lay a frozen lake. It was broken into exactly 1,000 pieces, and these pieces were so exactly alike that it might well be thought a work of more than human skill. The Snow Queen always sat in the center of this lake when at home. Little Kay was quite blue, nay, almost black with cold, but he did not notice it, for the Snow Queen had kissed away the shrinking feeling he used to experience, and his heart was like a lump of ice. He was playing among the icy fragments, joining them together in every possible way, just as people do with Chinese puzzles. Kay could make the most curious and complete figures, and in his eyes these figures were of the utmost importance. He often spelt out whole words, but there was one word which he could never succeed in forming. It was eternity. The Snow Queen had said to him, "When you can put that word together, you shall become your own master, and I will give you the whole world and a new pair of skates besides." But he never could do it. "Now I am going to the warm countries," said the Snow Queen. "I shall sail through the air and look into the black cauldrons." She meant volcanoes, Etna and Vesuvius. "I shall whiten them a little. That will be good for the citrons and vineyards." So she flew away, leaving Kay sitting all alone in the large empty hall of ice. He looked at the fragments and thought till his head ached. He sat so still and stiff that one would have thought he was frozen too. The winds blew keenly when little Gerda passed through the palace gates, but she repeated her evening prayer, and they immediately sank to rest. She entered the huge empty hall. She saw Kay, recognized him. She flew to him and fell upon his neck. She held him fast and cried, "Kay, dear, dear Kay, I have found you at last." But he sat as still as before, cold, silent, motionless. His unkindness wounded poor Gerda deeply. She shed hot, bitter tears. They fell on his breast, they reached his heart, they thawed the ice and dissolved the tiny fragments of glass within it. He looked at her while she sang her hymn. "Our roses bloom and fade away, our infant Lord abides away. May we be blessed his face to see, and ever little children be." Then Kay burst into tears. He wept till the glass splinter floated in his eye and fell with his tears. He knew his old companion immediately, and exclaimed with joy, "Gerda, my dear little Gerda, where have you been all this time? And where have I been?" He looked round him. "How cold it is here! How wide and empty!" And then he hugged Gerda, while she laughed and wept. Even the pieces of ice took part in their joy. They danced about merrily, and when they were weary they lay down, forming of their own accord the mystical letters which made Kay his own master. Gerda kissed his cheeks, whereupon they became fresh and glowing as ever. She kissed his eyes, and they sparkled like her own. She kissed his hands and feet, and he was once more healthy and merry. The Snow Queen might come home as soon as she liked. It didn't matter. Kay's charter of freedom stood written on the lake in bright icy characters. They took each other by the hand and wandered out of the palace, and as they walked on, the winds were hushed into a calm, and the sun burst out in splendor from among the dark storm clouds. When they arrived at the bush with the red berries, they found the reindeer waiting for them. He had brought another and younger reindeer with him, whose udders were full, and who gladly gave her warm milk to refresh them. Then the old reindeer and the young hind carried Kay and Gerda back to the little hot room of the wise woman of Finland, where they warmed themselves, and received advice as to how to proceed on their long journey home. Afterwards, they went to the Lapland woman, who gave them some new clothes and provided them with a sledge. The whole party now ran on together till they came to the boundary of the country, but just where the green leaves began to sprout, the Lapland woman and the 2 reindeers took their leave. "Farewell, farewell," they all said. The first little birds they had seen for many a long day began to warble their pretty songs, and the trees of the forest were bowed down with richly tinted leaves. Suddenly the green boughs parted, and a spirited horse galloped up. Gerda knew it well, for it was one which had been harnessed to her golden coach, and on it sat a young girl wearing a bright scarlet cap, and with pistols on the holster before her. It was no other than the robber maiden. Weary of her home in the forest, she had taken to traveling, first to the north and afterwards to other parts of the world. She at once recognized Gerda, and Gerda had not forgotten her. Their greeting was particularly joyful. "A fine gentleman you are, to be sure, you graceless young truant," she said to Kay. "I should like to know whether you deserved anyone running to the end of the world on your account." But Gerda stroked her cheeks and asked after the prince and princess. "They are gone traveling into foreign countries," replied the robber maiden. "And the raven?" asked Gerda. "Ah, the raven is dead," returned she. "Now his sweetheart is a widow. She hops about with a piece of flannel wound round her leg. She moans most piteously, and chatters more than ever. But tell me now all that has happened to you, and how you managed to pick up your old playfellow." And Gerda and Kay told their story. "Snip, snap, snurr, vassalur," said the robber maiden. She pressed the hands of both, promised that if ever she passed through their town she would pay them a visit, and then bade them farewell and rode on through the wide world. Kay and Gerda walked on hand in hand, and wherever they went it was spring, beautiful spring, with its bright flowers and green leaves. They arrived at a large town. The church bells were ringing merrily, and they immediately recognized the high towers rising into the sky. It was the town where they had lived. Joyfully they passed through the streets and stopped at the door of Gerda's grandmother. They walked up the stairs and entered the well-known room. The clock said tick, tick, and the hands moved as before. They could only find one difference, and that was in themselves, for they saw that they were now fully grown people. The rose trees on the roof blossomed in front of the open window, and there beneath them stood the children's stools. Kay and Gerda went and sat down upon them, still holding each other by the hand. They forgot the cold, hollow splendor of the Snow Queen's palace. It seemed like an unpleasant dream. The old grandmother sat in the bright sunshine and read these words from the Bible. "Unless ye become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." And Kay and Gerda gazed on each other, and all at once they understood the words of their hymn. "Our roses bloom and fade away, our infant Lord abides away. May we be blessed his face to see, and ever little children be." There they both sat, grown up and yet children at heart. And it was summer, beautiful, warm summer. The end. So that's it for Snow Queen. I hope you enjoyed that. And on Monday, we'll begin reading something new. So see you all then. Have a good weekend.